Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to Mindful Matters, episode number 2. Today we're going to continue our marriage series and talk a bit more in detail about the process after you've gotten married. Assalamu alaikum. Today we've got our guest, Murabi Atai Rabbi Hadi Saab from Queensland. Welcome to the show.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Murabi Saab, last show we had Murabi Kamran Mubashir Saab here and we spoke in detail about the process before getting married, the things that we need to look at, the pitfalls and the slippery slopes that we need to avoid. Today I want to talk more about what should one do once they have settled a rishta or have decided to marry someone. What are some of the issues that I want to discuss, some issues that we tackle once we've gone past that stage. So say you've now find a potential partner and you're looking to get married. How do you feel about the fact that there's weddings these days that happen where people spend, I mean, I've seen weddings with millions of dollars spent on it. So what is your opinion on the amount of money you should spend on that ceremony?
Well, technically, if you're spending millions of dollars on a wedding, that's, I think saying unnecessary would be an understatement, right? It's not something that Islam promotes. It's not something that Islam condones. And that's something that we can clearly see from the Sunnah, the practice of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as well as the practice of the Promised Messiah alayhi salatu wasalam. Whenever they got married, they had very simple arrangements made, right? And particularly, there's a lot of confusion in terms of what the Islamic practices are and what are those practices which are dictated by culture.
Yeah,
I
because
think that's a big issue that a lot of people face today.
Yeah, so in the southeast, we've got, I think, people have gone up to 6 ceremonies. They've got two different mehendis, and then they have a couple of barats. I can't even keep up anymore. So what is the exact Islamic process of getting married?
Yeah.
What are the ceremonies that need to be held?
So in Islam, technically, there's only 2 ceremonies. There's the nikah, which is the announcement of the marriage itself, right? Where in public, the announcement is made and you ask basically the groom as well as the father of the bride or whoever the representative of the bride is to accept the marriage. Of course, one thing which is particularly looked after is you have to get the consent of the bride before this announcement takes place, where her representative will either say yes or no in front of the public, right? So that's the nikah, and it's a very simple ceremony which usually happens in the mosque. Usually it's something where a few verses of the Holy Quran are recited which particularly talk about marriage and how to sustain a married life, how to nurture your marriage, etc.
Just a quick question there. Does it have to be in a mosque or can you have a nikah
No,
outside
it doesn't
the mosque?
have to. I mean, it can happen in someone's home as well.
Yeah.
I've led nikahs in people's homes before as well.
Okay.
As long as you've got witnesses there that can testify that the marriage has taken place, they can testify that now from this day onwards, these 2 individuals are husband and wife, right? So after the nikah has taken place, once you solemnize the marriage, then it is the practice of the Holy Prophet that the man must then give a invitation or a reception and treat his friends or family to dinner.
Okay, so is there any guidelines around that dinner? Because I think in our Southeastern society, essentially it becomes a show-off competition. So if X had 500 guests, Y needs to have 600 guests.
Right.
Yeah. So is there any guidelines around that?
Well, I think if you look at the narration of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it really puts it into perspective, right? I mean, the Holy Prophet, in one of his walima, he quite literally fed the Sahaba, his companions, a few dates, and that was it.
That's it, just dates.
That was the walima, yeah.
Okay.
So that was the walima, and I'm not saying that in this day and age you should just be feeding people dates, right? Everything is according to the circumstances, but it's also true that you also need to look at the status of the individual, what type of situation they live in, what type of background they are, right? If, for example, you are from a well-off family, it's also very relative to what kind of background or what kind of situation you find yourself in. So if you're from a not so well-off family, but you're trying to punch higher
your
than
weight,
above
yeah,
your weight,
yeah.
right? And you're trying to do something which a well-off family can do very easily, but it's very difficult for you, then that wouldn't be right.
Okay.
But at the same time, if someone's well off and they try to, be extremely extravagant just because they have the money to, then that wouldn't be right either. I think what Islam promotes is moderation. So you do things according to necessity, and of course, there's nothing wrong with, having a good time and spending towards a celebration. But as soon as you start going outside the purview of, just moderate behavior, and it becomes extravagance, that's when Islam doesn't look.
Yeah. I suppose the middle path is the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So that would be it in terms of the ceremonies that need to be had in an Islamic wedding, because I think even after the walima, once the bride and the groom go back home, there's quite a lot of ceremonies that are held.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
it. In Islam, these are the only two things. Culturally, some people will choose to have a few more. For example, because the reception is normally held by the male,
Yeah.
right? But naturally, the father who is now seeing off his daughter, he might feel that, well, before I do that, it's only appropriate that I also feed my friends and family to a reception. So, which is normally in our culture, in the subcontinent, it's known as the rukhsati.
Yeah.
Rukhsati technically just means that moment where you pray and you officially hand over your daughter to your son-in-law.
Yeah. Essentially means farewell.
Farewell,
Yeah.
right? But in those instances, certain families may choose to have a proper reception at that, and then there's nothing wrong with that either. As long as, again, you're being moderate, there's nothing too extravagant about it,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Okay, so the next step, I guess, when we would move on to, and we haven't really discussed this yet, is another thought that a lot of people have is that you can withhold the dowry for a unlimited amount of time or undefined amount of time. Is there any guidelines around what we need to do, how we need to pay the dowry for the bride?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think there's a lot of confusion around it, especially when you start going into the linguistics of it all. A lot of people will be thinking of that word in a completely different language, maybe in Arabic, maybe in Urdu,
Yeah.
right? Whereas when you say dowry, normally in the English language, dowry is something which is, oftentimes thought as something that is taken from the wife.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Whereas that's not the case in Islam, right? In terms of the word being called a dowry, many a times I would actually refer to it as a bride gift.
Yeah.
We call it a dowry because, again, we're limited with words that we have, right? And pretty much, it does describe what the word is in Arabic, which is haq meher,
Yeah.
right? Haq meher basically meaning the right of the bride, a gift that should be given to the bride at the moment of the wedding. The confusion that a lot of people have is that they think that the haq meher is associated with divorce, right? Because a lot of the times what happens is when divorce takes place, if someone hasn't paid the haq meher, then at that time, depending on if it's a talaq or a khula, meaning that if it's a divorce that the husband has sought after, then it's a talaq.
Yeah.
If it's a divorce that the woman has or his wife has decided to take, then it would be known as a khula, right? But depending on the scenario, what would happen is that the person would either, have to pay up the haq meher,
Yeah.
or sometimes even this could happen where the woman has to forfeit the haq meher.
Okay.
Right.
So scenarios vary, and I guess this is the opposite of what people usually think in terms of the conventional word of dowry. It is in Islam a gift that's given to the wife.
Yeah,
Okay.
at the moment of the nikah. So
Yeah.
that's the thing that's important to remember. So the confusion is that a lot of people think that this is something that needs to be given later.
Okay, I
But-
understand.
But haq meher is something which you give at the moment of the wedding
Yeah.
to establish the honor and respect of the person you're marrying, right? And this
Okay.
is a really important point that I think a lot of people may not even come across in this day and age, where they don't realize that in actuality, the reason why the bride gift has been appointed is because Islam is a religion which teaches you a very high level of sophistication. It teaches you to do everything at a very sophisticated level, right? So, for example, the 5 daily prayers that we do,
Yeah.
the 5 daily prayers are the most sophisticated way that you can pray to Allah. Otherwise, people pray with just raising their hands, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or you can pray
yeah.
by just thinking about Allah.
Yeah, we've got a varied range of postures that obviously
Yeah.
have the stimulate different
It's the
feelings.
most civilized, most sophisticated way for you to talk to Allah. So Islam teaches us to do everything at a very sophisticated level. And when you are now engaging in a relationship with a woman who for the longest time has lived with her father, for the longest time has looked after her chastity, and only for you she is now making herself available to you, right? In that instance, it's important that you also establish her honor with a sophisticated way. And that's why it's said that on the day of the marriage, you give her a gift which behoves her status, right? It's an amount which, establishes her respect, right,
Okay.
in society.
All right. So say now we've moved on from that stage. We've gotten married. We've announced our nikah. We've had a walima, and now you finally moved into a house together. Now there's multiple scenarios here that we can talk about. The first scenario I want to talk about is when you move in a house where you are living with the in-laws. That usually brings up a lot of complications for the couple. What are some advices that you can give us in regards to managing a harmonious relationship within the house where you have, say, some sort of unduly interference from your in-laws? What is the best way to deal with that for a couple?
Well, the first and foremost thing I think I would advise, and I would just quote our beloved Huzur, who in one of his Friday sermons, he quite explicitly and openly said that this is something that you shouldn't be going after anyway. As in, technically, you should try to avoid the situation in the first place.
Okay, so
Right.
is it preferable
So it's
for a couple to
preferable.
live?
Yeah, absolutely. It's preferable for you to not live with your parents. And
Okay.
it's actually the practice of the promised Messiah, alayhi salatu wasalam, whenever he would marry off one of his sons or his obviously when you marry off your daughter, she would go live with her husband. But when he would marry one of his sons, he would then also make it a point to separate them in a different residence. That doesn't mean that they would cut off
The relationship,
ties
yeah,
and
okay,
relationship altogether. That's
Yeah.
not true either, because we know from accounts from Hazrat Ammajan, from the wife, the most respected wife of the promised Messiah, alayhi salatu wasalam, that Hazrat Ammajan used to engage with her daughter-in-laws in a very unique manner. And they would always get together and work together and cooperate with one another, despite the fact that technically they were living in different residences, right? So first and foremost, it's best to avoid that scenario
Okay,
where you're
yeah.
having to live with your in-laws if you can. But then again, not everyone's situation's the same. Sometimes you might be the only son. You might be the only means through which, I'm talking about the man,
Yeah.
who can actually look after his or his parents, right?
Yeah, different socioeconomical
Yeah.
pressures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in such a situation, I've come across many boys or men, I should say, that are very particular. They would like to live with their parents because they would like to look after them, and that's absolutely fine. And in actuality, it's actually quite, something which is very noble.
Yeah, it's an
Right.
honorable thing to do, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, in that scenario, then you also have to ensure that you give both parties their due rights, right? And you're absolutely just in your dealing, right? So you sympathize with both your parents, but as well as your wife. And if you see something wrong, right, you do not in any way move away from justice. You're always fair to your wife, and you're always fair with your parents.
Okay.
Right? And you should always try to make sure that there is no kind of conflict between the two. Right? In many cases, sometimes it becomes a kind of an art that you have to learn.
Yeah, I think it's
Over
a acquired
time.
talent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's something that you have to work on.
Yeah.
But as long as you're holding on to justice and you're trying your best to be fair at all times, though many times it can be difficult, but there are many households that are very, very happy, and they're getting
Yeah.
along well because
So-
of it.
How do we then? That's scenario number one. Scenario number two is where the couple are fortunate enough, or they're able to just live by themselves. What are some good? What is the best way to live with the newly wed spouse? The new spouse.
I think it applies both ways absolutely equally. And actually, it's something where on the day of the nikah, on the announcement of the marriage, It's something which is explained through the verses of the Holy Quran,
Yeah.
not once, but multiple times, that when you're dealing with one another, you must deal with the fear of Allah, right?
Mm.
And what that means, and this is a really interesting topic, because, and the way I like to explain it, and I found it to be very interestingly explained and very eloquently, I would say, in the Holy Quran. The Holy Quran uses a metaphor, and the Holy Quran says that she is a garment for you,
Yeah.
and you are a garment for her, right? And particularly, what that means is, why do we wear clothes? We wear clothes to protect us either from the heat or the cold, and also to cover our faults or cover
Yeah.
our,
Cover up, beautify.
yeah,
Yeah.
to
Protect from the elements.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Protect us from the elements, to guard our privacy, and so on and so forth, right? So there's that one explanation, that technically you should be a protection for your spouse,
Yeah.
right? And the word nikah itself means fortress. It means that once you have gone through the nikah, right? Once, for example, in the Arabic terminology, it's known as mankuh, right? You are now fortified. Now you are a protection for one another. But the only way that you can truly be a protection for one another is if you truly become a garment for the other individual. And in another place of the Holy Quran, Allah Ta'ala says that وَلِلْبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ, right? That the best form of garment is
Yeah.
that of taqwa, right?
Okay,
So
yeah.
the Holy Quran particularly mentions how Allah Ta'ala has revealed to us or provided us garments, right, for particular purposes, right, that we've already mentioned.
Yeah.
But he also says in the Holy Quran particularly that the best type of garment is that of taqwa, right? As in, it's the best provision in life
Yeah.
is to have reverence for Allah, to love Allah, because that's how you can progress,
Okay. So
right? So
in
in
those-
terms of marriage,
yeah.
when both individuals become a garment of taqwa,
Yeah.
both individuals are treating each other with fairness and love for the sake of Allah, always keeping Allah Ta'ala in mind. Allah Ta'ala then says in another place in the Holy Quran that if you are particularly looking after one another, right, then naturally what will happen is that love will be created amongst both of you.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. That's
And
interesting
that
concept.
love is and Allah Ta'ala doesn't just stop there. He says that love is in actuality a sign of my existence. And that love I place between you because of the behavior that you have shown with one another. In actuality, what Allah Ta'ala is describing in the Holy Quran, and in many instances, technically with most things in the Holy Quran, Allah Ta'ala is describing to us in a very eloquent manner how the universe works.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
How the laws of nature work.
Yeah.
And one of the laws of nature is this, that if you will treat your spouse with fairness and love due to or for the sake of Allah, then naturally love will come about. And this is actually a very interesting topic. Why? Because in this day and age, there's a lot of controversy and confusion in relation to love.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of people,
Yeah.
and I'll be very frank about it, a lot of people go into marriage thinking or having an idea of marriage as though of that which they see on TV.
Yeah, happily ever after.
Yeah.
You've watched a few Bollywood, Hollywood movies. You think once you get married, what's a
Yeah.
fight? I don't know about that.
A lot of people
Yeah.
think that love is something which is purely based on just that initial attraction, right? And I've actually dealt with cases, or I've spoken with certain newlywed couples who are very quick to refer to this concept of love, and then also when the fight happens, they quickly refer to this concept of love as he's broken my heart, this has happened.
Yeah.
Whereas technically, we need to understand what love is, right? And according to the Holy Quran, love isn't something which happens just because, you like certain qualities about that person, so now suddenly you're in love, the way the movies will show it to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And the elements that the movies, I feel, show us, so that there usually be beauty or wealth. I think those are elements that we know anyway. So if
Absolutely.
you're
So-
with someone for 30, 40 years, how beautiful they're going to stay when they're 85 or 90. So I guess why go for things that are not there on a permanent basis anyway?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, at the
Yeah.
end of the day, even love, which is emotion,
Yeah.
is something which is transient, right? When Allah Ta'ala in the Holy Quran talks about things which are finite, when we think about finite things, we quickly, when it comes to material objects, we know these things are finite, right? It's very easy to persuade someone why you don't need the latest car, why you don't need to spend so much money, because at the end of the day, it's finite,
Yeah.
right? Because you can see that money or that wealth disappearing,
Yeah.
right? But when it comes to emotion, sometimes when someone's in the heat of the moment and they're completely heads over heel over the other individual, trying to explain to them that, this feeling that you have, though it's wonderful inside you, but it might not necessarily be the love that Allah Ta'ala wants for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It might
Right.
actually be something detrimental to you,
Yeah.
and you might be enjoying it in the moment. You don't
Yeah.
really
Whereas
know if it's...
what love actually is, something that not only does the Holy Quran describe, but also modern research now backs as well. And there's a lot of research that's gone into this, and psychologists and even philosophers will say that in actuality, love is something which is nurtured. And love is something which happens and it comes about when two individuals work with one another, right? And look at their relationship as what can we do for us rather than what can I do for myself.
So a lot of work goes into it.
Yeah, as in a lot of the times what happens is, or most of the time when there's a fight in a relationship, is because the individual is only thinking about themselves. Why did they behave this way with me? Why did they do this with me?
Yeah.
I shouldn't have been treated like this and this and this,
Yeah.
right? And naturally, the more you go down that path, you'll just keep going down that dark path, and it'll just keep hurting the relationship.
Yeah. So
right?
I was going to come...
And what happens is that initial love that you have, over time, it will disappear. It
Yeah.
won't exist, no matter how hard you try. No matter how beautiful your wife or handsome your husband is,
Yeah.
it will disappear.
Yeah. So I was going to come off to the topic of fights. It is amusing how quick we got from getting married to the topic of fighting, but we've got... I had some questions in regards to that as well. What is the best way to not get into a fight? I mean, I understand to have a thought that you might never get into a fight is pretty unrealistic. You are going to get into some sort of an argument because you, at the end, tying yourself in a union with someone that is essentially not yourself. So there's going to be differences. So how would you guide young people like myself who are about to get married? What should we do to avoid these fights?
I think a fight and a difference of opinion are two completely different things.
Okay, is there a proper
Right.
way to...
It's absolutely true that you can have differences in opinion. And it's absolutely true that if you don't control yourself, right, and if you're not realistic, right, then that difference of opinion can definitely lead to a fight. Right?
Okay, yeah.
So these are two separate things, right? It's not necessary that you should be fighting, though, that most people will at one point or another get into a fight, because at the end of the day, we're human beings, right? If we are not real with ourselves, then naturally at one point we would end up getting into a fight. Differences of opinion can always happen, but it's important that when that arises, then you respectfully talk to one another. A lot of the times what happens is that an individual sometimes is so involved in their own ego that they don't even give the other person a chance to explain themselves. They've already made their mind up. They shouldn't have done that. They should have known better.
Yeah, nothing
right?
will convince them.
Yeah, and you just don't get around to the point where you could have actually just sat down and asked the individual, why did you do this, or why did you think this, or why did you hold this opinion?
Yeah. So communication
Right?
essentially
Communication
is very
essential.
important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
But when you don't communicate and you have difference of opinions, and then that situation, when it blows up in your face and you're not ready to listen to the other individual, that's when you have the fight.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. So
Which can be avoided, right? If you were to just listen to the other individual, if you were to talk to the other individual, and if
Yeah.
you were to, again, be fair, if you were to at that moment think that, listen, I need to listen to that person, I need to give her a chance or him a chance because of Allah, right? Because Allah expects me to do so.
So it ties
Right.
back into the concept of taqwa.
Absolutely.
Okay. Another question that a lot of my friends actually have these days is, what is the best way one should conduct their privacy around their spouse? So, for example, a lot of people would say, "Oh, I don't really have to share my mobile phone password," or there's work-related stuff here, or whatever. Are those types of excuses just masked ways of not communicating properly, or I don't think that's healthy.
I think that's I would quite frankly say it's just immaturity.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, what type of privacy are you talking about? I mean, once you're married,
Yeah.
right? And I'm gonna try use the most appropriate words I can.
Yeah.
Right. Once you're married, right, you're sharing something that you would never share with someone
Yeah.
ever.
Yeah.
That relationship, that bond, you cannot enjoy with anyone in the world other than that individual.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
yeah.
privacy goes out the window at that time,
Mm.
right? Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that, for example, you work for a business and it requires you to keep the
Confidential data obviously stays,
You start
yeah.
coming home
Yeah.
and then you start gossiping about people
Yeah.
behind their backs, or you come home and you start revealing all your business secrets or
Yeah.
whatever work you're doing in the Jamaat, etc.
Yeah.
Right? That's absolutely wrong, because that's not something that's in relation to your relationship. That's to do with something else altogether. But when it comes to the both of you, right? If you're hiding something from your wife, then straight away you should be thinking that I'm doing something wrong,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Because technically I shouldn't be having to hide.
Yeah, but I meant
such
more from
things.
from an angle where some men would say, okay, I don't really have to share all my finances with my wife. I'm providing for her. Is that
Yeah,
it?
no, that's
Yeah.
fine. I mean, that's okay. Absolutely. I mean, many a times they may choose not to do so, because if they're providing in every other way possible, in the way that's prescribed by Islam.
Yeah, and what is that
Right.
way? So, is there a set structure that we should maintain in the house? I mean, I do understand that there is one, but I would like to know more detail about that.
No, principally, you should just be first and foremost ensuring that she's well looked after, right? She's being provided a home, she's being provided food, she's being provided clothing, etc.
Yeah.
Technically, you should also be giving her an allowance so she can spend freely. But that's why the haq mahr is there as well, because
Yeah.
sometimes many men may not have that idea, so they're forced to give something to her so that she can freely
Some money
spend
up front,
on
yeah.
herself.
Yeah.
So those things are there, absolutely. But that point that you said, that if someone does then, after doing all these things, doing absolute justice with the wife, if he then decides that, well, there are certain aspects of finance that I don't really need to discuss with her, because technically it's not something that's going to in any way be useful for this
Yeah.
relationship, that's fine. I'm talking about those things, more those details in life, right, which result in you breaking the trust of the other individual, right? You looking after your finances and feeling that, okay, this is not something I need to discuss with my wife, isn't a breach of trust.
I understand. So
Right.
it goes back to your
But
conscience.
if you're, for example, married with your wife, but at the same time you're talking to other females, and then you're like, well, I don't need to really disclose this to my wife because she's going to feel bad about it.
Yeah.
That's a breach of trust,
Yeah.
right? That's not
Rightfully,
right.
I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not right.
A lot of financial benefit with the wrong partner might just be a picture of hell, and vice versa.
And also because, there's so many ways that the Holy Prophet described this, isn't it? Once, he's out openly said that a person who can get married, is able to get married, and does not do so, he does not follow my sunnah.
Yeah.
Right? He is not of me. Similarly, he says that, by getting married, you've acquired half of your faith. That's because, the only being in this universe which on his own is able to operate to absolute perfection is
Yeah.
Allah.
Of course, everyone
Right?
is
and
in pairs.
everyone requires some sort of partnership to be able to improve. And that's the whole purpose of marriage. It's for you to work with one another and generate a peaceful life for one another, right? And you then, that point that I was making in the beginning, that when you work with one another, when you become a garment for each other and you treat each other nicely, you'll see that then a long-term form of love comes about where you genuinely admire the other individual.
It's also superficial
you
based
have
on.
a connection. That's
Yeah.
the true love, which then results in you further improving your relationship with Allah. And that marriage becomes a reason for you to have a stronger relationship with Allah. Right?
Okay.
There's so many things that you can learn from marriage, which would technically be otherwise impossible if you had not gone through marriage itself. Right?
Okay, Murabi Saab, Jazakallah so much. That's all we have time for today, but I really appreciate you coming down, helping us with this conversation. This was really helpful for me since I'm about to get married and I can pass this advice on to my friends. Jazakallah, thank you for coming. Well, that was all that we have time for today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode of Mindful Matters. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.